Welcome back to the Evan and Zach podcast. Today we will be discussing the crisis in Ukraine. Evan, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of talk about what's happening now. And we know what's happening now with the war, and Russia is struggling right now. They're not doing quite as well as they thought for one of the world's premier superpowers. So we're interested in what happens after the war, when it does end, if it does end soon. And first we're going to be talking about the economic fallout. One big thing that we actually talked about in class today is Ukraine and Russia are some of the biggest wheat suppliers in the world, with Russia being number 1 and Ukraine being number 5. So what happens when the two countries that account for 1/8 of the world's calories are in shambles and their supply chains aren't as good as they used to be? What happens to the rest of the world?
Right, like will we try and rebuild that infrastructure and those trade routes through Ukraine and Russia when this war is over? Or will we find other ways to source our wheat production? That's one question. And then also, there's obviously the question about, oil and gas, which has really affected us in the U.S. already and all over the world. It really is a global issue of these gas prices skyrocketing. And the question is, how soon will will we fix our trade relations with Russia and to get a better global gas structure of I don't know exactly how to word that, but will we be able to rebuild our gas infrastructure and our gas trade across the world, or will we have to find new ways of sourcing that?
Well, to add on to that, Russia controls a large portion of the fossil fuel trade in the world.
Right.
And now many businesses are avoiding Russia, and many countries are placing sanctions and not buying as much from Russia. So how does the world supplement Russia's absence of coal and natural gas? Or do they not? Do they realize we need Russia? So I wonder if this could potentially have big impacts in the environmental science field, where maybe the U.S. says we don't have enough fossil fuels to have enough energy on our own. Maybe we need to start relying more on nuclear energy and solar energy.
That's really interesting. It could actually end up having some really long-lasting impacts that could actually end up benefiting, the entire world in terms of green energy. And then some questions that I have specific to Ukraine is what happens to Ukraine when this is all over? So 3,000 civilians have died since Russia began its invasion in Ukraine in February of 2022. And 7 million Ukrainians have been displaced internally, so have moved from one region of Ukraine to another. And then an additional 5 million Ukrainians have fled from Ukraine to other countries. When this is all over, will those people come back to Ukraine, or will they settle in the countries that they fled to? And will the Ukrainians who moved around the country, will they return to their original region, or will they stay where they are? It's just a really big question for what happens to Ukraine after this is all done. You know what I mean? They've had so many of their buildings have been bombed. It's just going to take so much money and effort to rebuild all of that infrastructure. Do they just leave it abandoned and stay where they are, or will they try and return? I think that's a really interesting question that we'll have to see the answer to in the coming years.
Yeah, how does Ukraine rebuild from this carnage that Russia unleashed on them? And I think Russia will be punished, not maybe by laws, but I don't think they'll gain the same amount of respect, where before this you kind of had a triumvirate of China, the United States, and Russia as the three global superpowers.
Right.
Maybe Russia isn't seen as a global superpower anymore. Maybe they're not as respected in the UN. They don't have as much say, and China and the U.S. become the two premier countries in the world, or maybe even a third rises up.
I feel like this conflict kind of mandates the EU, not the EU, sorry, this kind of mandates NATO to actually spread farther east, because I know we talked about in our simulation a lot how there was an agreement between Russia and the EU about and I keep mixing this two up, and NATO about not expanding into the former Soviet countries. But now that this has happened, NATO can kind of make the argument, well, now that you've literally invaded a country, like we need to do this in order to protect ourselves. So you know what I mean? I feel like that's totally valid of NATO to now say that agreement doesn't matter anymore, and we're going to include all of these countries in NATO, and then it kind of, you know what I mean, kind of counters like Russia's power a little bit. Like you said, this might hurt their global hegemony.
Not to mention, I mean, Russia proved they can't take over Ukraine, which it was seen as kind of an imminent victory at the beginning of the war. And now I feel that more former Soviet countries could be introduced into NATO, and without the threat of Russian invasion, or maybe Russia will invade, but they know Russia is not as organized or as strong, and that they will also have global support.
And also, Russia couldn't successfully Russia couldn't successfully win the war in Ukraine at the beginning of the war, and now so many Russian soldiers and generals have died, and so much of their military equipment has been destroyed that if they tried to invade somewhere else, in response to like NATO expanding, it would be an even worse attempt, and they would be even less likely to win. I just think that Russia's global hegemony has really taken a beating during this conflict. Don't you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think, to conclude, I'd say that the economic situation is definitely fluid, and it's unclear how the rest of the world will proceed with two major countries having their infrastructure torn up. And on the political side, it's interesting to see how Russia goes forward without maybe the respect of the international community and without the respect of the former countries from the Soviet Union who might have feared them before and maybe do not fear them as much now.
Absolutely. There's so many open-ended questions. You know what I mean? This kind of war in the 21st century between two countries in Europe is very unprecedented, and there's so many open-ended questions that we are yet to answer. And that's it from the Evidence Zach podcast.
We're signing off.